It's Friday, and that means it's another edition of the Zogby Report, Real and Unscripted, the United State of our democracy, ? I'm here again with my son and partner, Jeremy. How you doing today?
Pretty good. How about you?
I'm doing okay. Let's mix it up, all right? We'll get right into it. Okay, I've got one topic, and then I know you're going to surprise me with your topic. But we have visited and revisited this whole issue of the congressional hearings on January 6th. And initially it was my view that basically all the people that were going to watch were intense partisans on either side. No net gain, no net loss for either the Democrats or the Republicans, just, if anything, a hardening of feelings on both sides. I've looked at the polls, and of course I'm watching here and there, and I have a decidedly different point of view. I think the hearings have mattered and are going to continue to matter. First of all, in terms of execution, I think that ploddingly and slowly the committee has unfolded evidence, been able to secure evidence from witnesses, have integrated videos and other pieces of evidence into a clear pattern. I think it's very damning, all in all, to the former president, Donald Trump, and to a number of his people. But most importantly, I think it's moved the ball. And I think it's moved the ball in a number of ways. Number one, we've already discussed this, but the Supreme Court Dobbs decision, which overthrew, let's say, Roe v. Wade, has changed the game considerably, so that we see movement in the U.S. Senate races, the key battleground races, towards the Democratic candidates, and the congressional generic vote, which measures the two parties and the House elections. An imperfect number, but clearly the more recent numbers are showing either a slight Democratic advantage or a slight Republican advantage, but there's been big movement. On top of that, Roe v. Wade, I think number two, that we've seen some movement away from the Republicans as well because of the hearings. Again, what we're looking at are suburban women, but also key elements, younger voters, non-white voters who are part of the Democratic base who had been moving away from Joe Biden, now slowly getting energized to vote Democrat. I think there's a whole new element here that's been introduced, and that is the question of Donald Trump. Donald Trump's candidacy in 2024, the lightning rod impact that has, and the landscape that now shows that Republicans' majority do not want Donald Trump to run in 2024, and may very well have enough, it looks like a majority, in fact, that may have enough to prevent him from succeeding to the nomination, and if anything, perhaps his effort at blocking Ron DeSantis or others in the Republican presidential sweepstakes who might rise to the fore. So I think in many ways, I think Roe v. Wade has been a game changer, but clearly I think that the hearings have impacted Republican and Democratic voters and not in the GOP's favor.
Mm-hmm. I'm tempted to say more about January 6th, but I feel that I've covered it quite a bit in podcasts over the past couple months. I do think that there are angles missing in the coverage, specifically about perpetrators and provocateurs involved, and the mounting evidence that has suggested that for, I think, are accurate allegations and that should be looked in, but you won't see that. But what I like to do is when there's the coverage of a story, that's being, really shined on and really driven, there's usually other stories that are overlooked. And last week there was a quiet bombshell. The New York Times came out within 24 hours, 2 articles. So everything that you laid out is convincing in the notion that there has been steam gaining for the Democrats and going forward. But there is something very troubling for the Democratic Party because, look, the New York Times is, I think, the quintessential institution of media in this country, and globally renowned. And within 24 hours last week, they came out with 2 articles. One in which the headline called into question Biden's age, literally said at age 79, is Biden going to be too old to run in 2024? And then talked about how at the end of his second term, he would be older than Reagan. Maybe as old as Reagan in running for his second term. I can't remember that detail. But then no sooner, hours later, another important headline and article came out saying that, referencing a poll from the New York Times, Siena New York Times, saying that Democrats want somebody different than Biden. So that is really the big story. So as much as, anybody wants to say Democrats are in charge or, they're turning things around, they've got a major issue when the quintessential media outlet, the quintessential newspaper of this country comes out and literally pulls the knife out and sticks it into Biden's side. How do you go back from that? How does an institution send out that strong signal and then maybe weeks later forget about it and say that, we want Biden? It doesn't look good for Biden. To me, it's a powerful signal, and it's hard to see an institution like that toning down after coming out so strong.
Okay, and I know you don't want to dwell on this, so because you have a topic of your own, but we're talking 2 different things here. We're talking 2022. We're really not talking about Joe Biden. Yes, Joe Biden, his name won't be on the ballot in November, but Democrats have an albatross right now, given his sinking poll numbers and rising inflation numbers and those sorts of difficulties. But don't get me wrong, there may be the entire debate now where there's smoke, maybe there's fire about Joe Biden's age, but we're talking about the internal dynamics of both political parties and their bases and what has happened because of January 6th. And in the short term, what was clearly perceived as a runaway victory for the Republicans in 2022, I'm going to hedge, of course, may not be such. It's still only July, but the numbers have turned, and I think January 6th has had, the hearings have had an impact on that, and have had especially an impact on Republicans.
Yeah, and I would just say in turn that the New York Times, in sending out those powerful signals, is responding to public opinion, which the public opinion is reflecting that the leader of the party is losing popularity, is not popular, is not a leader, and that has spillover effect into the independent vote, right? And so you're right, they're 2 different things, but that can affect 2024. That can affect the internal workings of the party, and that could throw the party into disarray going into 2022. And so I would just say, while some people, many people, whatever it is, are focused on J6 and focus on Trump and his guilt, don't miss, the other major story on the other side with the formerly perceived leader at the helm of the ship. I almost liken it to, is that the Bidanic? Did Biden hit an iceberg, and is he sinking? And the question would follow, back then, there weren't enough lifeboats to get the men on board. It was women and children. This time, there are enough lifeboats. And so will men, women, and children be screaming and lining up to get off the ship, or will they go down with the ship?
Okay. So January 6th hearings, your sense is no impact at all?
I think for those who were fixated on it from the beginning, and those who thought it was a double standard and pointed to, look at what the unrest that was going on in cities, look at the actual armed insurrection that happened in Seattle, where they closed off the city hall and the municipal buildings, which by definition was an insurrection because there actually were weapons. For those people who see those conflicting views, it just holds them in their views. I don't know that it moves the middle. That's the question, is does it move the middle?
Okay. I'm going to give you the last word, because otherwise I'll drone on about it. I do disagree.
Sure.
I think the middle has moved. So now, you've got a topic.
Yeah, and I've talked about before how we started this podcast in the middle of major changing events, even before COVID. 2019, and you and I weren't the only ones saying this. This was widely recognized, was the year of the protest. From Hong Kong all the way to Santiago, and in between, there was rebellion. It wasn't just rebellion in the streets like in Beirut, where the millennials were saying, get everybody out of government and ban them from government, and only new people can go into government. But the unrest was also taking place in terms of going back to Brexit and Frexit and Italy and all the Austria, and all these other notions of kind of an anti-elite, anti-establishment driven dissatisfaction with the way things were going in the world, and rising cost of living and standard of living dwindling and hope kind of dissipating and the trust in institutions falling. That was the large, a common denominator. But then COVID came. And quite literally in some parts of the world, COVID literally bolted people shut into the apartments, like in China. There were, many places, many provinces where that was the policy. And so naturally, the energy was pent up. And then we saw it kind of come back out in the summer of 2020, at least in the United States. And it's rearing again now. Right now, you see what's going on in Sri Lanka. You see what's going on in Armenia. There are protests in the streets. You see what's going on in the Netherlands. In history, there's talk about the pitchforks. The pitchforks are coming, and that signs, that's a sign for people like Marie Antoinette to get the heck out, flee, because otherwise you're going to get the guillotine. This time it's not the pitchforks, it's the tractors. Dutch farmers, in reaction to the nitrogen policies, pollution policies, that are punishing the farmers instead of the chemical industry who produce the nitrogen, and they're mad as hell. And they're looking to what happened in Canada, in Trudeau's Canada. And then, just as a recent development in China, what you see now is angry mortgage payers who increasingly by the day are saying, we're not paying our mortgage, which is tantamount to the call for a debt jubilee. And is that a 21st century signal of, the mandate has been lost? Because in Chinese history, there was the notion of the mandate from heaven, and when the people were mad and they rebelled, or there were signs of, discontent, could be floods or whatever, the mandate was signaled to be lost. And so this is all over the world, and you're seeing it more and more, and I just can't help but think a 2019 redux, and there's coverage of it, but to me, that's the top story, is 2019 perhaps exponential.
So we're going to get into these topics in great detail because number one, I just gave a talk, right?
Yeah.
The International Executives Resource Council, and among other things, talked about this global pattern of revolution, actually, launched by technology with young people in the vanguard, but all new rules, and we're beyond protest. We're in the streets and we're in cyberspace with this broad revolt. It's game changing, and it's here in this country as well. So I don't doubt it, deny it. I wish that media would cover the broad epical changes that are taking place better than they do. I would dare say that we've still got rumblings in the Middle East, including in Saudi Arabia, which are not reported upon. It's kind of difficult to do that.
Yeah.
But in Egypt and we've got rumblings actually everywhere.
Yeah.
We've got a Brazilian election, that's coming up, first round, just in a couple of months. You've got the traditional leftist and the new wave MABA, make Brazil MABGA or whatever, make Brazil great again, candidate. But it's not going to be that easy. The transition to power is just not going to be an easy one.
Yeah.
So we are witnessing the period of the 1300s through the 1900s all over again. The only difference is we're seeing it all, feeling it all, and watching it in real time, aren't we?
Yeah.
And it's hard to adjust.
Yeah.
So what's your point, your conclusion about all this? We should be knowing more about the big picture, the big story?
Yeah. I mean, when there are global trends, you gotta look at the global trends. I'm sure this is the case in a lot of countries. There's the tendency to focus on what the national media is covering, but the national media, and whether it's conservative or liberal, usually has an agenda, and I don't think anybody would deny that, but I'm just fascinated by how this isn't going away. This has been going on for a while. I mean, this, maybe we could say this started with Donald Trump and Brexit, but I mean, really, this goes back to what was going on in the Middle East in 2010, when food inflation was really hitting places like Tunisia and Egypt after the Great Recession. The seeds were sown, and it becomes a game of whack-a-mole where institutions that see that this disrupts the direction that they would like to have everything move towards, it becomes a game of whack-a-mole. You knock it down, but it's just going to keep rising up, and I don't see it going away. It's not, Canada wasn't a one and done. I just named 4 other examples here. I think the common denominator this time is, and this goes back to the French Revolution, let them eat cake, right? Now some people are suggesting let them eat bugs. Yeah. Move towards a diet of bugs, but you've got people whose lives are still pretty comfortable, whose standard of living are going up, and the prospects for the global middle class that were built, going back to the 80s and 90s are starting to dwindle. And what do you expect? So, who has the solution? And I'm not going to get into that, but ask yourself, who has the solution? Who created the problem?
I think it goes beyond who has the solution right now. I think you have 2 different levels. On one level, it will ultimately be determined, at least in the short run, by who has a model for a solution. But meanwhile, we're still in a period of creative destruction. And I think the destruction goes first. That's what we saw in the Middle East, round 1. We'll see it in round 2. I don't know. It could be tomorrow morning. It could be a year from now. But all of the symptoms that existed that created the Arab Spring are still there. They never went away.
For a global spring, right?
And a global spring as well.
Yeah.
Okay, didn't even get into Italy, but just in a couple of sentences, that broad coalition Mario Draghi's party and the five-star movement collapsed. Draghi resigned, but the president of Italy refused to accept his resignation. The implications of this are big. Italy is the second largest member of the EU. I mean, now that UK is gone, and so Italy was enjoying a reasonable amount of economic and political clout. This could pull them out of the EU. So there's that potential there. The second potential is, like everyone else, Italy has some serious immigration problems, economic problems, post-COVID rebuilding problems. But it also has, as is often the case, a non-functioning government. So we need to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
Good food, however.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And you're a fan of the Beatles.
Yep.
And I like the Beatles, but I was always a big fan of the Rolling Stones.
Mm-hmm.
And the song "Street Fighting Man." Check out the lyrics to that. Probably know a lot of people know that song, but that could be where we're at right now.
On that happy note, I'll see you.
Yeah.
Take care. Have a good week.